What I am going to walk you through is nutrition information, specifically targeting very simple changes. I'm going to talk more globally, and intermixed with that will be this cognition component, but there are some sort of background pieces of information that are helpful to know and understand before one can get that specific. Also, I will hope to clear some of your nutrition confusion, and then at the end provide you with some validated resources. It is absolutely true that we are what we eat. We know the obvious, whether or not what we eat is going to promote wellness with respect to physical well-being, not only body weight, but body composition, whether or not we will have the ability to be proactive in terms of reducing chronic disease. And more recently, we learned more in terms of cognition and maintenance of mental clarity. And so nutrition is one component of the pie. I will explain a little bit more the other components of that, to use that example. But what we do know, unfortunately, is that we are part of what we call the standard American diet. And it's no irony that that is just called the SAD diet. And what we know from numerous surveys throughout the past several decades is that we have a dietary pattern that is characterized by what we call a Western diet. So you can see on your screen, we have several hundred calories a day of just simple sugar, and there is no benefit to simple sugar with respect to nutritional quality. We barely eat one fruit a day, and a serving of fruit is considered to be one medium piece of fruit or a half a cup of juice, or if you're eating dry fruit, it would be equal to 2 tablespoons. So we barely consume a piece of fruit a day, barely 2 vegetables a day, and a vegetable serving would be a half a cup cooked or 1 cup raw. And to me, it's incredible the amount of processed foods, literally almost 60% of our total calories. And this isn't on an exceptional basis, such as holidays, but on a regular basis. The term ultra processed, what we're referencing are what you see on the screen. We're talking about all the processed foods, the meats, the bars, the cookies, the instant products, the soft drinks. And so clearly, this is not leading itself to a well-being situation. The term core food refers to a food that we eat with frequency, usually on a daily, indefinitely regular, such as weekly basis. And not surprising in the U.S., our core foods are hamburgers, which would be beef. We're not talking about a vegan burger, but hamburgers, hot dogs, and French fries. And incredibly, for the last 5 years in a row, the French fry gets the claim to fame as the #1 consumed vegetable. So it's no surprise that we're having the various health conditions that we have. You might say, why is it that we're not having the dietary advice that we have? Well, if we look this up historically, we actually in the United States started delivering dietary guidance literally in the late 1800s. And actually what you're seeing on your screen is the booklet that was produced from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Dr. Atwater was the very first director of the USDA, and it was our first U.S. guidance on nutrition. So that's really not the scope of what we've been missing in terms of why we are where we are. You probably know this from your medical school training, a small amount of nutrition that you had. We, for many decades, focused on looking at food because of what we need to eat in terms of what we call a nutrient. And a nutrient, by definition, is what you see. We might be able to make some of it in our body, but generally speaking, we cannot make enough endogenously or in sufficient quantities. So therefore, we do need what's called either an environmental source, such as vitamin D, or we need it from food. And a nutrient is a compound that is necessary to life. So what we recognize as nutrients are the categories that you see on the screen: carbohydrate, protein, fat, vitamins, minerals, and water. Now, I'm not trying to say we clearly don't need nutrients. We obviously need them to stay alive and to maintain optimal emotional and physical well-being, but it's not as simple as this. And so what I'm going to take you through in the next series of slides is a little bit more of a sophisticated look in terms of understanding recent information about why we really need to focus on the quality of the food, and that impacts both mental as well as physical well-being. So in the last several decades, particularly the last, I would say 20 years, what we've seen very clearly is that the health benefits of what we are eating is not just based on nutrient composition. Again, to be clear, it's not minimizing the importance of nutrients per given calorie in any particular food, but what we recognize is it's one component of why food is imparting health or conversely imparting a high risk situation in terms of chronic disease. So what I'm going to walk you through, don't panic, I'll be just very quick, but this is a group from Harvard, and this now, as you can see, is nearly 18 years ago, and they really began the stage of us understanding and ushering in to understand this concept that the importance of well-being, both mental and physical, is not just about nutrients, but it's really about the collective pattern. And so what they did, their sample size was very large, as you see. It was literally almost 45,000. Interestingly, this particular study was done with just men. And for 8 years, what they literally did was gathered what we call a food frequency questionnaire. What that means is that they are providing information about specifically what foods are they eating, and it's very delineated. You know, if you're eating bread, you're stating it's white bread, it's whole wheat bread. So it's the quality as well as the quantity and the frequency, which is very key. And that's hence the name, food frequency. And what they identified in all of these different individuals during 8 years, incredibly, they could delineate two major, what they called a dietary pattern. The one was what I showed you in the prior slide. It's called the Western dietary pattern. In other words, it's high intakes of processed foods, red meats, sweets, desserts, you know, very much in that vein. They also delineated what they called a prudent diet pattern. And that instead was characterized by a diet that now what you see is really a minimal amount of processed foods. By contrast, a higher amount of foods more in their natural state. So vegetables, fruits, legume, meaning different types of beans, whole grains, fish, and poultry. And so what they did is they literally found that in all these individuals, no matter how they approach the dietary and the data analysis, these are the two patterns that emerged. Now you might say, well, who cares? So what I'm showing you on the screen is what you're looking at is a table of relative risk for coronary heart disease. And so on the far left, what you're seeing here with my cursor, I'm showing you, it's the quintile 1. And that means these individuals really had very negligible amounts of what we would call that prudent diet. They had some fruit and vegetables. I'll show you in a second the amounts specifically, but really just a little bit. They were more in the Western pattern. Now, what you're seeing is the quintiles. In other words, as the numbers are increasing and we get to 5, these are the individuals that their dietary pattern really was characterized by what I just described as a prudent pattern. But what's remarkable is that we saw a significant reduction in terms of relative risk of heart disease as the person ate more closely aligned with this prudent pattern. So the first line is age adjusted, and you can see that literally just in the middle at this third quintile, and again, I'll show you what foods this means in a second, they dropped the risk of coronary heart disease by about 0.7 to 0.76. As you increase to really adhere to the prudent diet, you were able to drop your risk to 0.66. When they did all kinds of sophisticated data analysis, they basically still saw the same trend. The more one followed that pattern, the more significant their risk for coronary heart disease dropped. And so what you're looking at here, again, this is the same data, but I just wanted to show you, what the heck does that mean? So this is group 1. So they had the lowest adherence to a prudent pattern. So they were having about 1 serving a day of dairy that was high fat, less than a serving of fruit, 0.9, just a little over a serving of vegetables, about 1.3 servings, whole grain hardly, just a half of a serving, and a serving of whole grain is 1 ounce. So that would be typically, it would be either 1 slice of bread or 1 ounce, or cereals will vary, but ballpark about a half a cup. So barely a half a serving. Now, as you move, so that it doesn't take much change, here's my third quintile. As you just move up to about 1.7 pieces of fruit, not even 2, 2.5 servings of vegetables, the risk drops. And this was the fifth group, so that they literally now are at 3 servings of fruit, about a little over 5 servings of vegetables, and not quite 2 servings in the whole grain. Modest changes with significant reduction in coronary heart disease. And so the point I'm making is what I'm building for you is both in the area of cognition as well as physical health. In the area of mood, it's less well defined, but what we recognize is in addition to the nutrients that are in foods, it's about your total collective dietary pattern. Not on Friday night when you went out and you really splurged, but your pattern of intake over a period of time. We truthfully don't know how long, but we generally say that it's the pattern of your intake over weeks, months, and years. And this is an extremely important concept in terms of risk for different chronic diseases as well as poor health. Probably you've heard something about the Mediterranean diet. That's one of the 2 very common dietary patterns that we recognize. We see differences in terms of inflammation, lower inflammation with higher adherence to the Mediterranean diet, more well-being, just some interesting information beginning to emerge on increased maintenance of cognition, especially in older adults with higher adherence to the Mediterranean dietary pattern. And it's really the prudent diet that I just described to you. The only differentiation is what I've circled in red, so that predominantly they're consuming olive oil as their fat. They do have a regular intake of nuts and seeds, considerably less saturated fat, and absolutely negligible, if at all, presence of processed foods. And to make the point, it's not a diet. It is a pattern of intake. And there are obvious differences because it's really named after the region from which this originated. And so it isn't one particular diet with X number of servings in different groups. And this is a pyramid just to show you the visualization. And again, it's everything that I've been talking about. Probably the one point that I didn't mention, interestingly, is that this particular dietary pattern does have the presence of wine on a regular basis. It is within moderation, but they absolutely recognize that part of the Mediterranean diet is a regular intake of wine. There's also a second diet that you should be aware of. That's a dietary pattern, not a diet, and it's called Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. And the DASH diet, again, has a plethora of data to demonstrate reduction in blood pressure, reduction in risk for coronary heart disease. And you can see on the screen that it's essentially the same concept of what we've seen with the Mediterranean diet and with this concept of a prudent diet. The only difference is it does not specifically stipulate that it is olive oil as the fat, and it is a little bit more liberal in terms of consumption of sweets. I'm going to talk to you a little later in terms of what we've learned about health and macronutrients, and a macronutrient would be carbohydrate, protein, and fat. All I want to point out here is look at how radically different the carbohydrate levels of the 2 diets and the fat levels, especially the total fat. And yet we know that literally there are an enormous volume of data for both of these dietary patterns with respect to well-being in almost every parameter. Really nothing much well defined in terms of emotional well-being, just very generic. But these are the 2 dietary patterns that we recognize are very healthy. Now I'm going to flip for a moment and show you a visualization of what I talked about as the sad American diet. Time Life did a very interesting profile. They went around the world, and what they wanted to photograph was a typical family. So in this case, we're looking at a family of 4, which is typical for the U.S., from North Carolina, and look very closely at that screen. Can you even find the poor real food? If you search, there it is, grapes up, and there's tomatoes hiding. And so it really is this incredible visualization in terms of where we are with our typical food intake, that Western diet, just incredible number of boxes and containers because of how much highly processed food we have. And they use about $350 a week. Contrast this with Ecuador, which, mind you, they are well nourished, they are not malnourished, and you notice the absence of animal products, really predominance of plant slant foods, and again, you are hard pressed. In fact, I don't see anything at all that's processed. Now, you might say again, why am I making these points? Because where I'm going with this is to conceptually build that what the cutting edge information is, that as you choose your foods, both for emotional and physical well-being, it's about thinking nutrients, thinking about dietary patterns, and recognizing this term called whole food synergy. And what we mean by that is that we now absolutely know without question that choosing the most unprocessed food as possible, that there is a synergy in there from all of the different compounds that impacts well-being with respect to both emotional and physical well-being. And so it's not about grabbing the vitamin C bottle instead of eating the orange. The orange has probably 50 different compounds in there that are going to promote your well-being versus that vitamin C, even though you might equate the vitamin C and take your supplement versus a pill. And so we recognize that other component is this concept of phytochemicals. Technically, it's not a nutrient, but you will find some refer to that. And it's this idea that there are compounds within foods, again, the unprocessed ones, that essentially have additional benefits. They're beginning to explore the emotional, the cognition component of this, but essentially we recognize it for immunity building, free radical scavenging, and this makes a major difference again. And so I just quickly listed, there are literally hundreds of different phytochemicals, but to make the point of what you're seeing, as you notice, these are not in the animal food choices. They are in the plants and particularly associated with color. And that's why you'll often hear, try to have your diet as bold as possible, as much color as possible. And that's the whole scientific rationale behind it. So when we look at a global basis, because if you understand this, you will be able to then make decisions for all different types of your concerns. So when we look at a global basis, what is a healthy dietary pattern? What do we know without any controversy? And what we know is that it's not prescriptive. They are themes of patterns of intake. So it's mostly plant-based. It's not exclusive. It's not necessarily a pure vegetarian, but it's a plant slant. You do not see the highly processed foods that we are accustomed to in the U.S. It is not this high predominance. There is the presence of animal products. If dairy is included, it's predominantly the no or low fat. Many different cheeses, definitely yogurts. It's often and mostly the local. Sometimes it is organic. That would depend on the region of the world. And if they're consuming animal proteins, it's eggs, it's fish, and it's lean meat. And interestingly, there's a concept that has become more sort of prevalent in the U.S. is that it's not just what we're eating, but it's understanding what is the animal eating, because that definitely impacts our ultimate health as well. And we don't have the fixations that we do in the United States on, avoid X amount of sugar, avoid saturated fats. But to be fully transparent, it's because you saw the differences in the image. You can see those visualizations that the reason they don't have to have these fixations is that you're not choosing in a typical grocery store like we have in the United States of 6,000 ingredient foods, and the bulk of it is processed. So they don't have those processed foods in there, and hence they can, sort of stay away from these fixations. To move us back to the United States, when we look at recommendations, the dietary guidelines for Americans, that is published by the government. These are scientifically evidenced statements with respect to guidance on specific how you should eat. They are designed for healthy individuals over the age of 2, and they are published every 5 years. So our most recent ones were published in 2015. And so whether it's the dietary guidelines, whether it's the Heart Association, whether it's the Cancer Institute or the Diabetes Association, look at what they're saying. Consume beans. These are not green beans. These are legumes, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, seeds, nuts of all types in a calorie-balanced manner, slanting towards plant-based, and the Heart Association adds, consume fish twice weekly. What I will share with you, which is not commonly discussed, but we do not have an optimal agreement on the amount of total carbohydrate, total protein, or fat in the diet as a percentage of daily caloric intake. There is a range of recommendation, and this is why I do think there's a lot of confusion in the sort of media world about nutrition, but we do not have clarity on that. And we definitely do not see a global agreement in terms of a prescriptive diet like we see frequently in the United States. If we turn our attention to another study that was done with the blue zones, and this is where you have very interesting, more input on the emotional well-being component. This was a study commissioned by the National Geographic Society. And what they did was literally go around the world and identify pockets of locations in which not only there was a very high prevalence of centenarians, but they were fully functioning. And so the places you see on the screen, those were the places they went to in Japan, Italy, California. I have family actually in Ikaria, Greece. And so all of these places are where they found these individuals. What did they identify? Successful aging was defined not just in terms of longevity in years, but being able to be mentally fully engaged, mentally and physically, in a daily life. And so these are the factors that they identified. When we look at the food, it again is wine daily, interestingly. Again, not fully vegetarian, but plant slant, particularly a variety of beans and nuts. The 80% food rule meant that they didn't go on a diet, but what they did is whenever they were presented with food, they generally sort of self-regulated to about consuming 80%. Downshift was fascinating. What they meant by that was that they found at least 15 to 30 minutes every single day to essentially get away from the world and meditate. Or one individual was very cute. He was a man who was 103, and he lived with his family, actually, sons and grandchildren. And he described that he used to go in the closet. Nobody could find him, so he would just essentially, shift away from the world. They all felt that they had a life of meaning. They belonged to a faith-based community setting. The concept of family first was not genetic line, but essentially that there were individuals that were close to them that they identified as their family. The right tribe, that's a concept that I also share with my students frequently. And what it means is that what is very critical to well-being, emotional, very strongly, is that you surround yourself with individuals that will always have your back. The old saying that everyone will ride with you when you're in the limo, but who's going to take the bus with you? And that's what they found as well. And they were all very physically active. So if we look at all of this, the commonality to all of this, interestingly, is this plant-based theme. But in particular, what I wanted to share with you, because again, it's not going to be out there exciting in the media, making headlines, but it's very firmly entrenched in just a plethora of data, is that what really is one core factor for all well-being is that when you focus on a food first and a predominantly plant-based diet, the dietary fiber content is very critical. And that term refers to the indigestible component of the plants, the part that you can't really digest, and so it serves as a source of fiber. Probably from your medical training, you will remember way back when that we divide dietary fiber from foods into two broad categories based on solubility. And so an insoluble fiber essentially absorbs water. It literally goes through your GI tract, essentially unchanged, and it quickens the time that it takes to go through your GI system. And essentially, therefore, it is a source of fiber. It does not create a viscous gel in your GI system. That's contrasted to a soluble fiber, which basically now will, in fact, form a viscous solution because it absorbs water, and that viscous solution actually does just the opposite. It slows down the rate of absorption, and so this concept of rate of absorption or rate of appearance means how fast is your blood glucose or your other macronutrients appearing in plasma. So it definitely blunts lipid and postprandial glucose in your plasma. And these are just, some examples for you of that, just the different food sources. I just put this in here because I'm sure either you or your patients, you've recommended these and they ultimately achieve increasing fiber, but notice that they are different types of fiber and so their mechanism is different. They work well when an individual is not willing to make a lot of dietary changes. Obviously, I'm trying to promote dietary change. So therefore, it's important for blood glucose, insulin, and diabetes, because what it's doing is slowing your rate of absorption of glucose and essentially creating a much lower apex of your glucose level, and it even increases the area under the curve for glucose. Your goal is to achieve 20 to 35 grams of fiber. And this is a study done to look at very old, but to make the point that we have decades of information about how important fiber is. These individuals served as their own controls. They had the same calories, same macronutrient distribution. The only difference was 20 grams of fiber. And unequivocally, you can see the slashed lines. There was their high fiber diet wanting their glucose. We go to the grocery store and we stand there and debate between, 10 different types of grain. But the point is that it is not about how many grains, it's about being the whole grain. So 100% wheat just means it's all wheat. It doesn't tell you it's whole grain. Organic is the processing, stone ground is the technique, and these are just different types. What you're looking for is what you see on the screen. Those are your whole grains. And when you look at a label, you should see whole grain as the first ingredient. The link between fiber and heart disease is also very clear. It's independently associated with reduction in lipid profile and even blood pressure, definitely decreased with our inverse association with inflammation. And again, not to belabor another study for you, but same data set, different study group. Again, look at how long ago it was. What you're looking at here now is heart disease, and again, it's the same concept. On your left side is the lowest fiber intake, about 12 grams, and when you start to even just move to about 19 grams, so 7 grams difference is the difference between 2 pieces of fruit. You can see that as you move more to the high fiber intake, you significantly have lowered your relative risk for heart disease. And physiologically, as you remember back from medical school or your practice, the efficacy of this is essentially because the fiber is actually binding the bile acids, therefore it's not reabsorbed, and hence you have to use more of the cholesterol that is stored in the system. And you also have an increase in the binding of fiber to dietary cholesterol, and so you excrete some. And so these are just showing you what is a source that's a good source. 3 grams of fiber, that's considered a good source, and these are just some examples. So, why am I so focused on this? Because what we've learned is that this is a very simple takeaway message that you can do for yourself, and it really is the most impactful choice that you could make. Why am I saying that? Because if you're focusing on fiber in your diet, instead of having juice, for instance, whole fruits, instead of that poor iceberg lettuce that you're drowning in salad dressing, choosing darker greens, sneaking in some vegetables and a tablespoon of beans in that salad, instead of grabbing the pretzel, which, promotes itself as being so great because it's low in fat, that is not as healthy as hummus, for instance, with some, vegetables or nuts and seeds. And you can see the other examples. The point is that as you start to fiberize with food, what you're literally doing is meeting all of the different health guidelines with respect to food. You're having more of a plant slant. You're having more nutrients in the diet, both quality and quantity and array. You're increasing the phytochemicals. You're increasing the color. You are not accomplishing your vitamin D recommendation, but collectively, all of these inherently are going to improve both mental and physical well-being. When you move towards more plants, inherently, you're also going to decrease your processed foods, and so less of the kind of fat we know is detrimental to health, which is called a trans fat, and you're likely to lower your saturated fats, which generally speaking is also associated with an increased risk of various chronic diseases. Most of the fat that we eat is hidden. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just to include it in for being inclusive. And essentially, it's predominantly in the foods that we don't even recognize we're having as a source of fat. From the Heart Association, what you're looking at is trying to focus on what we call the omega-3s, which are from fatty fish, shellfish, flaxseed, some nuts such as walnuts and canola oils, and moving away from the saturated and the trans fats. I just included this in here. We'll have plenty of time for questions if you want to talk to me specifically, because there's a lot of questions about different specific fats in the diet. When we talk about proteins, the focus is not to overdo it, and again, try to have a mixture of vegetable as well as animal sources for sure. Vary your choices, and that's the whole point with respect to protein. So my first clinical pearl for both wellness with respect to cognition and physical health is keep it simple, stupid. I'm sure we've all heard this in our training. You don't need to be worried about chasing all the nutrition trends. It's core foundational information that we know that will be the true test of time, that you can make a simple change that will make a huge difference. When you look at what you eat, the next time you are grabbing lunch, or if you're eating there now, be honest with yourself and put everything you're eating, and just, even if you're not using a plate, put it on a plate. See what you're doing in terms of any of the categories. Are you avoiding one? Is the poor fruit and vegetable kind of lost where you're focusing on protein? Think not only nutrient dense, but unprocessed, color, and of course the fiber source, so that you're achieving this synergistic package. Where's your fiber? Are you thinking about that when you take any single bite? That will make an enormous difference. Watch the sizing. We are a value nation, and so we go to our fast food places, and for 99 cents, they're going to add on several hundred calories. It's really sort of the nation of, mass expansion. For portion sizes, what you see on the screen, those are standard sizes. I've given you a little bit in terms of the fruits and vegetables and bread. For protein, a serving size is considered 1 ounce of cooked meat, poultry, or fish, or 2 tablespoons of peanut butter. I wanted to also point out to you that we are now living in a world where it's literally every single grocery store has thousands of new food items in any given year. And many of the manufacturers love to focus on just one nutrient. Again, here is my example of vitamin C. I'm not saying that nutrients are not important. However, there is no benefit to nutrient fortification of a food that lacks all of the other characteristics I've been talking about. So adding one nutrient, such as you see here, a good source of vitamin C, that's great, but this is still considered a junk food that will never move to the realm of being healthy for you, either mentally or physically. Read the food labels. The term low calorie is 40 calories or less. Low fat is 3 grams or less. Here's my 3 grams of fiber per serving to be a good serving of fiber, And you can get an idea in terms of just looking at the package, whether or not you're in the realm of where you want to be. I did want to just sort of get to the end here and focus on a supplement, because I'm sure you're going to have questions about dietary supplements. And again, food should never be replaced by a supplement. It should never be a crutch for you. But what I want to just make a couple quick messages. What you're looking at here, there is a law that is out right now that essentially means that any dietary supplement does not need any sort of pre-approval by the government, either for efficacy or safety. It is really, unfortunately, a consumer beware. And so the best advice I give to my patients is to look right here for this extra validation. And essentially what that means, here you're seeing USP, that an extra independent agency has reviewed that particular supplement, and they have essentially assessed that it is indeed containing what it says on the label, that it's in the declared amounts, that it will be dissolved easily, what you see on the screen for those quality tests. This is the most important component. This disclaimer down here essentially is required by the government. It does not mean that the government has pre-approved this particular product. So these are the different third-party verifications that we now recognize. There are a couple of others out there, but I did want you to be aware of these, because these are the logos that you'll see. And again, they are independent agencies, and to be very clear, they will not necessarily check the entire plethora. For example, if the company has 20 different supplements, it doesn't mean they're checking all the supplements, only the ones that you specifically see it on the label. And to conclude, I want to be very clear that nutrition is one component of this. The mental and cognition component is still being delineated. It is very challenging to look at the studies in that area because it really depends on the population of subjects that they've used in the study, where their initial mental well-beings, where did they start? But we well know that nutrition is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, in terms of a healthy lifestyle, just to conclude here, is physical activity and what we do in terms of smoking, drinking, use of toxins such as drugs, and of course, alcohol. And so it makes a difference. The last little reference here, everybody wants to age well. We all want to be that person who is the little grandfather or grandmother that can literally walk by themselves and, be fully in a good state of mental well-being. This is a study called the Baltimore Longitudinal Study. They followed individuals from the 1950s, and what they've identified is it doesn't matter what domain you looked at. The number one determination of quality of health is mobility. Can the person still independently be mobile? And that is a function of not just nutrition, but physical well-being. And so I conclude with Mr. Singh, and I apologize, I forgot to check. In the spring when I did a presentation, he was 103. He never even started physical activity until his mid-80s. He started running to try and deal with his grief from the death of his son. And he has the world's records for a number of different, being the oldest person in the marathon. It's very impressive. So you'll have to look him up when I finish and see if he's still alive. And these are from the CDC that I'm not going to, I'm sorry, that it's just from the CDC why physical activity is so important. So it's aerobic as well as muscle strengthening. And to conclude, one last study, they just looked at activities. They didn't do anything, sample size 14,000, and your first graph here is no activity, and only 15 minutes a day, you can see they started to reduce their risk significantly of all-cause mortality. So yes, we have recommendations, but a little is fine. And I conclude with this because I couldn't resist. It's a confusing world of nutrition and food, and we are all engaged. And so especially in Ohio, I would tell you we have a very active group of dietitians. And so as a physician, I would encourage you to go to eatright.org for a dietitian that is in your area to help you sort through all this. Thank you very much. I think we made it.
Thank you, Dr. Barkoukas. We did have a question come in earlier, and you may have touched on this a little bit. And I also think Dr. Ballister is on now if he wants to follow up as well. But he had asked if you could if you had comments on NAC and omega-3 as anti-inflammatory supplements specifically.
Yes, the omega-3s in particular, let's see if I can go back to that, are definitely the data from all different age groups. Now, I think there's not that much data in children, to be totally transparent, but definitely in the adult and especially in the older adult, that they absolutely act as anti-inflammatory agents. And so there's more focus, to be very honest with you, on food sources. More recently, we've had some equivocal data emerge on the benefit of actually the supplementation, and that's probably what the basis of your questioning, I'm guessing. But we definitely recognize that food sources absolutely produce a reduction in inflammation. Does that help? I can't tell.
We think so. Yes, thank you for that clarification. I'm hoping you could also maybe elaborate a little more on particular strategies for our physicians on how to increase the right foods into a busy schedule, especially when convenience is so paramount these days.
I would say that you, and don't shoot the messenger, but you do have to plan ahead a little bit. My husband is a physician, so I can totally relate. We used to laugh that we would see each other literally in passing for decades of his training. But for example, you could purchase fruits for yourself, unripened bananas, put them in your car if you're going from point A to point B, or even at your desk. They will not be overripe by the time you're going to get to them. So you literally do have to pre-think to have very simple choices particularly if you want to focus on non-processed foods. And it can be done, but I would encourage you to take it just one day at a time and set just one objective for yourself. I mean, you know this from behavior modification counseling of your own patients. Keep it simple. Identify one goal for yourself, even if it's just that, okay, this week I'm going to literally focus from no fruits any at all to 1 fruit a day. And then the next week you move to 2 fruits. So you start very small, but you will achieve that success, and then you can move to the next food group for changes.
Wonderful, thank you. Are there any other questions from our panelists or our participants? And feel free to use the chat function if you'd rather submit your question in that format. I do have one additional question for you. Considering that Thanksgiving is just around the corner, is there a better time of day to indulge in food items associated with the standard American diet?
Generally speaking, and I think it was Oprah and her team that made this very well known, the more you can have the bulk of your calories earlier in the day, with the logic being that physiologically, if you can have any activity level and, you know, essentially use some of those calories versus that your meal is at night and then you're going to bed and there's really no opportunity. There's a huge debate within our profession, truthfully, you know, is it the total calories or is there a huge difference in terms of time of day? And I think we all know very media savvy people that will say don't eat after 6 o'clock. My challenge to that is that there's no such thing as a typical schedule. You know, half of Americans work odd hours, and so you've got to be a little bit more realistic. I don't know if that helps you, but well, it's at least one step.
For the pumpkin pie after dinner on next Thursday, but I get that. That makes a lot of sense. Right now, it doesn't appear that we have too many additional questions, so I'm going to wrap this up. And thank you, Dr. Barkoukas, for leading our session today and providing such valuable insight into the question of, are we what we eat? To our physician participants, thank you for participating in today's Wellness Wednesday series. We hope you found the presentation helpful and a good use of your precious time.